The eastern diamondback rattlesnake, Crotalus adamantius. America's largest venomous snake has had a rough go of it. With habitat destruction and fragmentation, road mortality, and human persecution, including the barbaric tradition of rattlesnake roundups, this icon of the American Southeast is down to about 3% of its historic population. Dr. Bruce Means is a preeminent ecologist and herpetologist. He has published over 300 scientific articles, numerous books, and other publications, and appeared in documentaries on networks like PBS, BBC, and National Geographic. Dr. Means has spent much of his life studying the extraordinary wildlife of the longleaf pine ecosystem, and has done his part to ensure that the eastern diamondback can avoid declining to the edge of extinction.
I'm Bruce Means, and I've had a wonderful life studying the ecology of the planet and all the amphibians and reptiles that are my specialty in it. We're in Panhandle, Florida, an area that I dearly love, and have actually lived here almost 60 years now. I was raised in Alaska where there are almost no herps, so when I came here to go to school, I fell in love with the longleaf pine ecosystem that's all behind me, in which lives the eastern diamondback rattlesnake. So it's a long story, but at one point I got an opportunity to work at a research station nearby where we're sitting, or I'm sitting, and it happened that that research station had a nice population of that animal on it. Now this was in 1976. And so I went to the literature to find out what was known about the eastern diamondback, and it was virtually nothing. Well, here I was at a research station, and at that point I had just got my PhD on salamander ecology, and I decided what a wonderful project I could work on right here. Anyway, so in 1966 I began studying a population of the eastern diamondback in North Florida, and I was the second person to use radio transmitters in following them and doing a study. Over an 8-year period, I marked and released about 129 eastern diamondbacks on an approximately 2,500 acre area of rolling clay hills that had a version of pine forest like the one you see here, but not the native one. There's a long story there. Anyway, it was a really thrilling experience, and I discovered many interesting facets of the animal's life history. And then after I left the research station, I continued working on the eastern diamondback off and on. And 40 years after I initiated my original study, I finally published a book on the entire life history and ecology of the eastern diamondback. It's called Diamonds in the Rough. And so up to about 2017 when the book was published, the book has all of my research data in it, plus all the literature that I could find that had ever been written about the eastern diamondback. Besides rattlesnakes, I favor amphibians, salamanders and frogs, and there's a whole large story about those things. Like so many animals that live in the eastern United States, well, almost globally anyway, habitats are disappearing and species are declining. the eastern diamondback, not the least of which. And the first thing that anyone can determine is if you do a Google Earth search of the southeastern U.S., the range of the eastern diamondback, and take a look at what the landscape looks like, there are like 95% of all the land that used to be part of the eastern diamondback range is either urban or suburban or roads or agricultural fields, especially in this part of the world, spray irrigation fields that are up to a mile in diameter. So the habitat that has been lost is the principal reason the animal's gone. And then the remaining habitat that's available for it has, in addition to been shrinking, it's also not managed well. A lot of that remaining habitat is different kinds of vegetation that grows up that the eastern diamondback doesn't naturally live in. The principal habitat, the original natural environment of the eastern diamondback was behind me, the longleaf pine ecosystem. Longleaf pine used to account for 60% of the landscape from about Virginia, southeast Virginia, to East Texas, and now there's less than 5% of it left. That 5% is in bad shape because the longleaf pine ecosystem requires fire, and most people don't understand how important it is that a given site that is a natural fire community needs to be burned regularly. In the case of the longleaf ecosystem, it should be burned every 1 to 2 years, at most 3 years. And when the habitat that you have, let's say you have a few hundred acres or a few thousand acres, it's embedded in an environment with people and towns and houses and other human constructs, you can imagine the difficulty trying to burn a site because of smoke, because of the possibility of fire getting onto private lands and the like. So great many things have caused the eastern diamondback's decline. I've even petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service to consider it as a threatened species, which has not been ruled upon yet. A practice of rounding up rattlesnakes began in the 1950s, both out west, involving the western diamondback, in Texas largely and Oklahoma, and here in the Florida, Alabama, Georgia area, involving the eastern diamondback. I've been around attending and looking at those roundups ever since the early 1960s, so a long period of the history of the diamondback roundups. And at first they were quite objectionable to me because the idea was for men to go out, and women, and collect all the rattlesnakes they could, bring them to the given roundup site, try to sell them and butcher them, and otherwise teach people that snakes are bad and evil, which is not a good thing, I didn't think. At first it was my impression that the roundups were doing some harm to the eastern diamondback. In fact, they were, because I published some papers on studies I did of the impact and the number of snakes and the size of the snakes over the long history of all the roundups in the eastern U.S., and discovered that 400 or 500 individuals were brought in the early years, but that began trailing off, and the size of the snakes began declining over about a 40-year period, which indicated to me that they were making an impact on the eastern diamondback. So over the years, I and many other people have pressured the roundups in the eastern U.S. that involve the eastern diamondback to become wildlife appreciation festivals. And doggone it, if over the last 3 or 4 years, the last roundup in the eastern United States involving the eastern diamondback has done just that. So now the local folks can come and appreciate nature. There are programs where people who are knowledgeable will display snakes and show them and teach people about the value of snakes, especially rattlesnakes, and there isn't any more harvesting of them. Unfortunately, that still goes on out in Texas and Oklahoma involving the western diamondback. So let's hope that the western diamondback roundups will one day become wildlife appreciation festivals and stop their exploitation philosophy, where people get the idea that killing snakes and abusing wildlife is a good thing. It is not, in my opinion. Longleaf pine communities are really savannas when they're in their natural condition. And the natural condition is that they're burned every 1 to 3 years by naturally caused lightning fires generally. Now we have to prescribe burn a site on that basis to try to manage the site like nature would manage it. Because longleaf savannas is the appropriate term for longleaf communities were so prevalent, they probably also are very ancient. We know from fossil studies that grassland types of environments have been around for 20, 30 million years in the southeastern United States. And no doubt the longleaf pine ecosystem has evolved from those ancient grassland environments. And it turns out not only the eastern diamondback, but the pine snake, the gopher tortoise, the gopher frog, the eastern king snake, coachwhip, black racer, I could go on and on, hognose snake, and the southern hognose especially, and a whole bunch of other snakes particularly, including a whole bunch of other animals, evolved in and are best adapted to the longleaf pine ecosystem. So it's no wonder, or should be no wonder, that there are so many endangered and threatened species of that group that I just mentioned, because the principal environment in which they evolved and to which they're best adapted is largely almost gone. And these animals, including eastern diamondback, have to survive in what they can survive in the man-made environments that we leave behind. Because of the decline of the longleaf ecosystem, I mentioned the eastern king snake as being suffering from the same kinds of problems. And in my own career, I've had opportunities to study some outrageous declines that we don't really understand the cause of, involving the eastern king snake, Lampropeltis getula, and its varieties. I had at Tall Timbers, where I had the rattlesnake study ongoing. In an 8-year period, I marked and released like 26 or 28 eastern king snakes. 20 years later, some colleagues up there did a very intensive 1 or 2 year study where they tried to trap every snake they could find on the property. The eastern king snake was completely gone. And in the days that I did my work, I wasn't actually trying to purposefully trap eastern king snakes. I just marked and released those that I encountered as I was doing my rattlesnake study. So that story is repeated in many places. We know all over the range of the eastern king snake in Florida and parts of Alabama and Georgia, it has declined. It tends to be more commonly found near coastal environments and wetter, marshy environments anymore, but there's so many disappearances and declines of animals in our part of the world, and probably all over the world, that no doubt it's related to something that humans have done to the environment or to the animals, chemicals or whatever, habitat reduction especially, that so many problems have occurred. And the eastern diamondback's just another example of it. I must say, I was very much honored to be the first person to find a really special population of king snakes between the Ochlockonee and Apalachicola rivers in Panhandle, Florida. And I spent many years breeding them and discovered that a couple of different morphotypes there, the speckled and the wide-banded ones, bred true. So this is before the days of DNA, when I wasn't a DNA jock, and found some other colleagues who did use DNA to discover that that population was so distinctive, they first named it as a subspecies after me, which I'm very proud. And later, after they did more DNA work, they elevated the subspecies to full species rank. So Lampropeltis meansi is a snake that bears my name, of which I'm very proud. And whether it's a full species or a subspecies, it sort of doesn't matter so much as the fact that the population between those rivers, it's a relatively small population, is unique and breeds true. And as you go away from the rivers, as those individuals breed and interbreed with the eastern king snake, you get classic intermediate individuals. So it's an interesting lesson in evolutionary activity that involves probably sea level fluctuation, where when the ocean levels were a bit higher at times in the past, it isolated a highland between those two rivers on which not only the king snake but the brown-chinned racer were isolated and evolved, as well as over 15 species of plants that are found almost nowhere else in the world but between those two rivers. So something interesting evolutionarily went on, not just for the king snake and the brown-chinned racer, but for a whole bunch of plants, including an endemic genus of lily. One of the benefits of being 84 years old is that I've been around a long time and have been interested in and doing studies on the ecology of this part of the world all that time. Well, for about 60 years anyway, the last 60 of my life. A long time ago when I first came here, I fell in love with salamanders, and I was keen to learn about the ambystomatids, especially the flatwood salamander. We didn't know anything about its breeding ecology. So for several years in the winter, I'd go out road cruising looking for populations and couldn't find them, whereas other ambystomatids like the mole salamander and the opacum, the marbled, and the tiger bred in December and January. So finally, one October 10th, I discovered the flatwood salamander migrating. And then I realized that it was a fall breeder, not a winter breeder. So I started doing studies on several areas where in those days, there was one spot especially along a road that went along the western side of the Apalachicola National Forest. I actually observed about 200 migrating animals to breeding ponds on one side of the road. And over the years, 20 years or more later, unfortunately, the side of the road where the animals were migrating to was private property owned by a timber company. They had gone in there and completely destroyed the area, clear-cut it, and they plowed the land up and bedded it such that when the salamanders were tried to migrate to their breeding ponds, they were only able to follow ditches that went nowhere. And so that entire population got obliterated. And I've published on that. It's a well-known, well-documented example. And we now know that there are two species of flatwood salamanders, one on the western side of the Apalachicola River and the others on the eastern side. And they all pretty much have a very similar life history of requiring flatwoods ponds in the longleaf ecosystem. Those ponds usually have cypress in them. But because of the poor management of the few remaining properties, including the National Forest and a local wildlife refuge, have not been sufficient to maintain the ground cover conditions that benefit the flatwood salamanders. So they both are, one is a threatened species and the other one is now an endangered species. And it's largely because the habitat is not in the best shape it can be in. Even examples of the longleaf pine that it's still found in, because in order to have those situations in their best condition, they have to be managed like nature naturally managed them. And right now that's not being done very well. I'm often asked, what do we stand to lose if we lose the longleaf pine ecosystem? Well, we've largely lost it already. If you know anything about the red cockaded woodpecker, it used to range throughout the entire longleaf ecosystem, maybe 90 million acres. And now it's confined just to this forest that I'm sitting in, the Apalachicola National Forest, and a few other spots around, but this is the biggest left population in the species environment. So what's in store for the rest of the world? I don't like to tell you what I really think. Too many people, too much development, too little care for the rest of the world we live in.